It is again a pleasure and an honor for me to be here at the University of St. Joseph. After our first meeting a year ago, more than a year ago, we thought that it would be good to continue, and now I think it is an opportunity to indeed to continue. And actually, well, maybe a few words about myself. I'm a kind of wandering lecturer. I go and here and there to different places. I'm mostly based in Moscow, and in Moscow I'm in charge of the reformation of the educational system of the Russian Church. So I'm a kind of church bureaucrat. Also, I try to teach patristics. My main field is patristics, the teaching of the on the fathers of the Church. Occasionally I go to different places, and actually I've done a series of lectures on the history of the church art, of the art of the Eastern Christianity. This series includes lectures on the iconography, on the history of the sacred image, on the history of the sacred music. Sacred music is a church music, and it's how it developed through the centuries. Last time I lectured here on the sacred image, on the history of the iconography, and tonight I'm going to talk about the history of the Eastern Christian architecture. The lecture is called Sacred Space. A few words about what does it mean, the sacred space. When Christians started to identify themselves, their theology, their lifestyle, how they should live, how they should consider themselves in this world. When a Christian, civilization was born, actually, a part of that civilization was exactly the understanding of the space around people, how it should be considered. What is the space? What is how should it be treated vis-a-vis the faith, the understanding of the Christian in this world? Two quite different approaches appeared in that time. One approach was to consider the entire world as a sacred space. The entire ecumene, the entire world was the space which was created by God, which was consecrated by God, which was sanctified by God, and through Christ was received by God into its communion. This theory in particular was promoted by some early Christian writers like Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, who developed an idea of recapitulatio, reconciliation, or taking under the head of Christ of entire being. This theory presupposes that everything in this world, everything in our life, is created by God, and through Christ, through the incarnation of God, taken into communion with God. In this, according to this approach, there is no special sacred place. Everything is sacred. Everything, the entire world is God's world. And Christians in this regard don't find any special, any specific, any particular place of sanctity for themselves. Another approach presupposes that there are some spaces of particular sanctification, of particular presence of God. This theory goes back to the Old Testament ideas, or even wider to the ideas of the ancient world, which identified places of special presence of God, regardless of God, of what God people believed, because in the ancient East had an idea of particularity of God. God was something particular, or someone particular to or ascribed or given to a special people, or special people were given to a particular God, and particular gods had particular places of their presence. This particularity of the presence of God in the ancient world was also shared by the Jewish people who actually lived according to the Old Testament, who believed in one God, in the creator of everything. And the idea of particularity of presence of God is embodied in the Jewish temple that Jews built for their God. And that was a special place where God only can be worshipped and addressed. So these two approaches coincide, went together in the Christian tradition. And the Christian tradition somehow moved between these two approaches. One is the universalist, the approach which designs no special place of God's presence. And another one is... No, it's okay, it's okay. I'm just waiting. I will start now with the presentation after I say a few introductory things to give you a background of the birth of the Christian architecture. These two approaches, as I mentioned, they came together in the Christian era, and actually we find both of them present in the Christian tradition, the tradition of Christian architecture. Right now we'll see how they developed, and we'll see tokens of the both approaches in the history of the Christian sacred art. Before I start showing you the images, I want to say that the Christian architecture, well, from the very beginning we find these two places, two approaches. One comes exactly from the idea of the Jewish temple, as I mentioned, and we find places of special worship in the early Christian times. We also find places where there was no any particular designation for worship. Probably the earliest examples of the places of worship of the Christians were the catacombs. The catacombs were the places where the Christians buried their dead. Again, in a couple of minutes, I'll show you the catacombs. I'm sorry for that, but I want to, before I show this, I want to explain you. The catacombs are probably the first examples of the Christian sacred space. There is a number of stereotypes about the catacombs. Probably many of you have heard of the catacombs of Rome, for instance. The catacombs of Rome were not places where Christians found their refuge. That is one stereotype which exists about that sacred space. The Christian catacombs in Rome appeared as a place of Christian burials. The ancient Romans, we most know about the Roman catacombs. The ancient Romans, they didn't bury their dead. They burned them. There wasn't an idea of putting dead bodies into the earth. That was somehow a Jewish tradition, to put them into the caves. It is connected with the idea of resurrection. It became even more emphatic among the Christians when the Christians realized, where they were taught by the apostles and by the early teachers, that their bodies would be resurrected. They stopped, even those Christians who came from the pagan background, they changed the practice of burying their dead. They moved from burning their dead to putting them into the earth, burying them. This demanded from them to find a place where to put their dead. In Rome, there were no cemeteries, as simple as that. Cemeteries in the modern world, places where the body of dead can be placed, because the bodies were burnt and the trashes were put into special columbaria. And the Christians in Rome started putting the bodies of their dead into the catacombs. That was the initial place which we can identify as a sacred space for Christians. So the idea of the sacred space started somehow with the change of practice of burying dead, with the idea that the bodies have to be put into the earth, into the caves in that particular case. Then Christians started commemorating their dead. They started gathering together to the place where they buried their dead. And that became, the caves became, the catacombs became the first place of worship. A part of that, Christians gathered together in homes. So no designated place, no temple, no church, no no special place for worship. The first special place for worship was, as I mentioned, the catacombs, and just only because Christians had to bury their dead there. So gradually, an idea of special designated place started developing. We find this start not only in Rome. The most famous catacombs are obviously in Rome, but our topic is the Eastern Christian architecture. So we find samples of first catacombs as early, as ancient as the Roman for instance, in Greece, on the Greek islands. An example of this architecture is the catacombs on the Isle of Milos. Maybe you've heard of the, well, of course, I'm sure you've heard of the Venice of Milos. Milos is the island where this famous statue was found. And this is also an island where old catacombs as well existed and were used by the Christians for the same purposes as they were used in Rome. Thus, the practice the practice of designating special spaces for worship started equally in the West, in Rome, and in the East. And we find samples of this in both parts of the Roman Empire of the time. So this is the list of the Roman catacombs, just for your reference. And this is, yeah, it's about the catacombs of Milos, of which I just mentioned. Another special place, another kind of special places, which were used by the Christians as a special place of their stay, of their worship, of their devotion, became caves used by monks. Here on the picture you see one of this. Of these caves. Monks as hermits were a kind of embodiment of the early Christian ethos in practicing their Christian duties. Monks initially were not an institutionalized part of the church. They were not a kind of order as we know them now. They were just normal Christians who wanted to embody in their life the fullness of the Christian call. That's why when they started, when the Christian church in the 4th century started to be a kind of established church, a church recognized by the state, and not only that, but also a church which became a part of the state establishment. Some Christians felt a challenge for their Christian call, and they wanted to preserve the ethos of the early Christian communities in their lives. That's why they escaped. They went to the remote places, to the deserts, and lived there the way they wanted. To. There they found places where they stayed, places of special difficulty, spaces of special, so to say, restrictions. First, monks like St. Anthony the Great, he lived in a variety of peculiar, strange places, like a tomb, Egyptian tomb, like an abandoned Roman fort, or a cave. And actually, those places where monks lived, where they found their refuge, also became places of designated worship for those monks first. And then after they died, their disciples came there and venerated the place, because the place was inhabited by a person they really respected. And those spaces again became spaces of special, as they believed, special presence of the grace of God, spaces of special, so to say, worship for them. So that was another impetus for developing of the designated Christian places of worship. Well, this is an example. Well, it's not very good. You can't see it very well. It's a fragment of the cave of St. Savas, nearby Jerusalem. It's a monastic community which was established in the 5th century. And monks preferred to live in caves. This is one of the caves. This is the cave of St. Savas, Agio Savas. The inscription, well, A-S, you can see probably these words. That was a continuation, kind of continuation of the tradition of caves, special places of asceticism and special places of worship and special presence of God, or God's grace, if you wish. There is another interesting example, the caves in Cappadocia. Recently, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, in Cappadocia, archaeologists found underground cities, huge, immense cities with up to 10 floors, stores downwards, 100 meters deep, which were actually the places of dwelling of Christians, special dwelling of Christians. Well, the caves appeared, or they developed, especially in the 5th, 6th century, when the Persians invaded Byzantium. They went through Cappadocia, and the local people found their escape, their refuge in the caves. In the caves which were dug out artificially. They were not natural caves. They were spaces just dug out. They started digging out those towns, underground towns, even in the era before Christianity, pre-Christian era. They used them to keep their animals. So they were rather small, caves, one floor, so to say, one floor under the ground, just to keep their animals. Then, with the passage of time, especially under the Persian invasions, the Christians started digging out all those, started deepening all those caves, and they actually created a system, a network, a complex network of cities. So far, over 30 cities found, discovered in Cappadocia. They imposed special lifestyle, or they reflected the Christian lifestyle, because they were like, like one house in which many families live. The Christians were obliged, or local people were obliged to live in the same place, live together as a community in one house. They just had their own cells for each family, and they had everything inside which they needed. They had a church, they had a school, they had some common places, some common rooms which they shared, and they were forced in this way to live a communal life, which reflected exactly the way that the Christians were supposed to live from the very beginning. And they also gave a special dimension, so to say, to their worship. They were concentrated, they were gathered in one place, and they used that place as a sacred place, and they regarded it as a sacred place. Later on, just a bit later on, or even simultaneously with the same time, in Cappadocia, in the same area, we find monastic communities established in the same way. They just took a mountain, they dug out tuff. Tuff is volcanic kind of sand, which when it touches the earth, it becomes hard. So it is easy to dig it, and when it touches the air, it becomes hard. This is the quality of the soil in Cappadocia, where people dig out the towns, and it is also the quality of the mountains in Cappadocia. So it is easy to dig out things, and then it becomes a hard dwelling. Monks, following probably the example of the local people, started digging out all those caves for themselves. Now specifically for the life of worship, not just to escape the Persians, but also to live together and to be in one place. Thus, the idea of gatherness, of getting together, of living common life, of making common space of the habitat emerged. If we compare this with the monastic dwellings in Egypt in the 4th century, where the cells of monks were scattered around, they were not concentrated in one place. They didn't actually have a common place of worship. They didn't have a common space, one sacred space. In Cappadocia, we find this kind of sacred space. And actually, it became so popular that still you find hundreds and hundreds of churches dug out in the banks of the river, rivers that go through, in the mountains around there. They appeared in different centuries afterwards, and they exactly reflected a new idea of getting together, worshiping God together, and spending time in one place, and worshiping God in one place. Just one moment, let me. Yeah. Another example of such caves is the caves in the modern southeast Turkey. Historically, it was a part of Syria. Now, and it was historically called Turabdin, the mountain of worship. Now this part belongs to Turkey, and they, in that part of the Christian world of the time, developed some other interesting patterns of the sacred space of asceticism and space of worship. Guess what is this? Well, when I saw it for the first time, I couldn't guess what it is. It's a kind of encavement like this. This one, yeah? In the wall of the church. It's impossible to imagine how they used it. This was exactly the size of the human body. So a monk would come to the wall, would stand close to this wall, would hide himself in this encavement and pray to the God without being distracted by anything. And this is an example of the sacred place as well, as it was developed in Syria in that time. And another one feature, imagine that this space, this room, has no windows and no doors. This is a church in Turabdin, in one of the monasteries of the 4th century in Turabdin. This church was designed without any easy access. You can only, slip through a hole to the church like this, and you get out through the floor. And there is no windows, no doors, just this encavement. So you hide yourself doubly, and you pray in this way. So this is another example of peculiar use of the yeah, let's see, of the sacred space. In the same region, another interesting and rather unusual way of using the space was invented. Yeah, it's yeah. This is a so-called stylus, or stilos, the Greek word which means a column. Monks used special buildings which were actually elevated platforms, columns like this. They might be up to 10 or even more meters high. Their size would be 2 sin 2 meters, like this, and they lived on those elevated platforms or columns for many years. For instance, the person who initiated, or with whose name this lifestyle is associated, Simeon the Stylite, used to live 37 years on such an elevated platform. So he stayed for 37 years on the top of the platform, and he actually never went down. He received all his supplies, all his food and water from the downstairs. He used ropes to elevate this stuff to the top, and this was his sacred space as he designed it, and it became extremely popular as many monks followed him, and we have a series of styles of columns in the same area in Turabdin, where monks lived. Maybe it's not so long, not 37 years, maybe less, but still this was a kind of usage of space for sacred purposes, sacred reasons. Another example is closer to the Slavonic countries. These are the space of the caves of St. Anthony in Kiev. The monastery which was established in the 11th century by St. Anthony, who went to Mount Athos, and he saw the way that the ascets there lived, and he tried to implement the same in Kiev, modern Ukraine, and he established the monastery, and the brothers of that monastery lived inside the caves for approximately a century. Then they couldn't stand it anymore, so they went up and they built a monastery upstairs, and they started using the caves for burial purposes mostly, and for the purposes of worship. In the meantime, I see I can make it more appropriate, the picture. Yeah, eventually. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, approximately the same, the same quality. Anyways, so this is another sample of the sacred space, used again by the monks. Still, hermits use caves. This is an example of a cave used by Macarius of Corinth on the Isle of Chios in Greece. He spent several years in this cave. Interestingly, there is a feature which was noticed by scholars that sometimes hermits, they used two caves to live in. Because if you live in one place, in one cave, you get bored by the view whatever beautiful it is from the one place. So they moved from one place to another place. They spent some time in one cave, then they changed it to change the view. And this one was one of the caves where Macarius of Corinth lived. Well, again, I can recall, say, Ethiopia, near the monastery Debre Libanus, the central monastery of the Ethiopian Church. If you go there in the monastery and look around, you see mountains full of caves, and still monks live there. Well, I think the life in the caves there may be even more comfortable than the life for ordinary people. But again, this lifestyle is still practiced and then still can be found. Now, after this rather peculiar and unusual and maybe strange ways of using and designing Christian space, sacred space, we move to the space of worship. Worship for larger communities, for the communities as they started developing in the after Constantine, post-Constantine era. And we start with Basilica as a first type of a Christian church. Here, in appearance of this type of place of worship, a special church, we find exactly features of the Old Testament Jewish approach, the echoes of the old Jewish temple, and, if you wish, echoes of the pagan worship. When, say, Greeks and then Romans used special temples to venerate their gods. And as we said, particularity of temples reflect particularity of gods in the ancient world. And we find how this ancient pagan, even if you wish, approach was re-evaluated, and some features of it were used by the Christians. So Basilica is the first type of the Christian temple, of the Christian church. And initially it is a pagan, non-Christian kind of worshipping space. As you see, the Latin word basilica is a Greek initially. It means basilikistua, royal arcade. And it was initially used as a public building, and then was used as became used as Christian churches. Initially in the Roman part of in the western part of the Roman Empire, and later on in the eastern part as well. Here you see one of the earliest and probably the hugest basilicas of the ancient world, Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine in the Roman Forum. That's what remains from that basilica, and that is incredibly huge. And this type of the church building became used by the Christians probably because it was a public place, and the church used public places for worship. So the main idea of the place of worship was not that it should be a sacred place. The main idea was that it should be a public place, a commonly accessible place. Hence is the word for the church. The word for the church, Greek word, ecclesia, means, derives from the verb ekkaleo, I call out. And ecclesia in the Greek word means also a gathering of the dignitaries, of the officers, of the public officers, of the people in charge of the people of the city. To worship God, to be a Christian, meant to make a common thing, a public thing. Liturgia, the Greek word liturgy, liturgia, means common practice, common action. This idea, this concept of worshipping God together publicly demanded that public places like Basilica to be used for the Christian worship. Basilicas became extremely popular in the Constantine era and immediately after Constantine. The most famous basilica is the one of the Nativity of Christ in Bethlehem, and this one is the Basilica of Resurrection in Jerusalem. Its core was built by Constantine in the decade of 20th of the 4th century. This basilica actually huge, and it covers many other things inside it, like this Kuvuklion, the Church of Resurrection, where the tomb of Christ is hidden. So basilica, this huge basilica in Jerusalem is actually, it's like a city. It's like an arcade, or, well, if you allow me to say, to make a comparison, it's like a modern mall where you find many, stores inside. So that was in the 4th century the idea of, at least of Basilica of the Resurrection, where all the places of the gospel story were hidden, were covered by one building, Basilica of Resurrection. This is a Basilica of Nativity. If the Basilica of the Resurrection was rebuilt many times since it was built initially under Constantine, this basilica was practically left as it was built by Constantine. So you can have an idea how it looked like in originally the 4th century. That is the place of the birth of Christ in the Basilica of Bethlehem. Ancient basilicas were not only public places, but they were also places of worship of pagan gods. And here you see examples, 3 examples of how pagan temples were turned into Christian temples. Pagan basilicas were turned into Christian basilicas. One is Dodon and Epirus, it's modern Greece. Parthenon in Athens again, modern Greece, and Theseion in Athens also. Well, probably not all of you know that the famous Parthenon was turned into the church, Christian church of Sophia, of the wisdom of God, and Theseion was also turned into a Christian church. So there was a practice of turning those ancient temples dedicated to particular gods of the ancient pantheon to the Christian churches. Thus, this secured the transformation of Basilica to a place of Christian worship. Another example of an old basilica turned even pagan basilica turned into a Christian basilica. This is a basilica of Achiropietus in Thessaloniki. Achiropietus is not made by hands, not created. That's how it was, well, how it was built, and then how it was turned into the Christian basilica. Now you can see types, various types of basilicas. You see them numbered. One type is like found in Syria, a cross-like type found in Milano, St. Apostles in Italy, and Ravenna, Jordan, Dalmatia, Croatia, Greece again, Athens, Greece, Epirus, and Cyprus. So various types of basilicas, some of them rebuilt to look like cross-shaped. Other types of basilicas. Regardless of the variety of the types of basilicas, the main idea of basilica is that it is somehow a long, huge space like this one. These things are secondary to basilicas. The main thing is this. It's a long space. And that is the main feature of any basilica. There was also a variety of roofs which were developed in the meantime in basilicas. You see them on the picture. Well, also basilicas were, of course, rebuilt inside, and the space there was reconstructed to facilitate Christian liturgy. And you see here various types of interior of basilicas. All of them, they're pretty nice. If you see them, there are some remnants which still there of the interior. They are pretty nice. It's white marmor and open space. You can see everything what is going on inside, and it's really it's very light. Well, some more information about different kinds of laying bricks in the walls of basilicas in different places. You see the area of basilicas covers exactly the entire Roman Empire of the time. Well, simultaneously, soon after basilicas, another kind of churches developed as a type of the Christian architecture. Those are so-called centric churches. The centric churches is an interesting thing. They have a completely different idea behind them. The centric churches are mostly the churches of commemoration. The shape of such a church can be different. It can be circular, or it can be octagonal, or it can be a kind of cruciform, cross. But the axis of the church is just in the center. It's not like, in basilicas, the axis would be this one. Okay? In centric churches, the axis is the vertical one, not the horizontal one. The vertical one. Though it's not basilica, it's centric, because this was added later on, this part. Initially, this sepulchre, the Church of Resurrection, was like this. What is the difference between the horizontal axis and the vertical axis? The difference is that the vertical axis means that this is a place of commemoration of dead. It is. There is a variety of deaths, of course. We know in the Christianity we speak about many deaths. Christ was dead and he resurrected. That's why the churches dedicated to him, like this one, the Basilica of the Resurrection, is centric church, because it is a tomb. Though it is a tomb which gave resurrection to Christ, but still it is a tomb. This centric style church is also, well, this rotunda of St. George in Thessaloniki. Initially it was a mausoleum built by a dignitary of Thessaloniki for himself, and then it turned into a church to commemorate Christian dead. Or this one also. This rotunda, a small Hagia Sophia of St. Sergius of Bacchus, was built in the 6th century to commemorate Byzantine soldiers who fell asleep in the war campaigns. And this is now it's a mosque, but it used to be a Centric church. Or there is another kind of Centric church. It's Baptisterium. This is an example of Baptisterium in Ravenna. Baptisteria were centric, with the vertical axis as its main axis. Why? Because in baptism Christians die in order to resurrect. Baptism is death in order to give new life to a Christian. That's why the places where Christians were baptized were also built in this centric style. So there is a variety of death. The death of Christ, death of Christians when they baptize, people when they baptize and get resurrected, and eventually the death, the physical death, which is to be commemorated in the churches of the same type. So this type of centric churches was developed exactly for these purposes. Another sample of an Eastern baptisterium in Ravrona in Attica in Greece, not well preserved as in Ravenna, but still the circle shape and centric church. In the meantime, the architecture developed further, and a new step in its development was undertaken by Justinian, a great emperor who was probably the greatest ruler of the Roman Empire in the Christian era, and he contributed to many fields of the Christian life and to the life of the church. He also introduced a new style of architecture, Christian architecture, particularly the style of basilica with cupola. So he added cupola to basilicas. It was a tricky thing. The difficulty was how you combine a tetragonal shape of basilica with a circle of the cupola. How you could stick them together. That was a difficult task, and Justinian, or better to say his engineers and architects, found a solution to this problem. They invented this kind of connection, these pendatives. So they allowed to connect a tetragonical shape of basilica with cupola. This was a great invention of architecture of that time. Don't take it for granted. The most famous church built in this type was St. Sophia of Constantinople. Probably the best known church of the Byzantine period. And it was exactly, you see briefly a story of this church, I won't repeat it. It was a huge construction for the time, probably the hugest. It was a construction to impress people, to impress especially barbarians who came to Constantinople, and well, they were really just, they forgot about themselves when they saw this incredible building, which they never saw in their life. It's like to see skyscrapers of Hong Kong, I don't know, for modern people. So it was like, that's what was St. Sophia in the time. Now it looks like this. Of course, it's new. There are new additions to this building, to this complex, these minarets. But more or less, the shape is reflecting the initial design of the church. That is a scheme of the church. You see, the main feature, basilica, a long one, tetragonical, connected with a cupola. through triangles. And that was the design of Justinian. Some cuts, horizontal and vertical cuts of the basilica. Another example of such kind of basilica is the Church of St. Apostles of Constantinople, which did not survive. It was demolished by Turkish invaders in 1461 in order to give space to build a Fatih mosque. And it was second in its greatness after Sophia in the Eastern Christianity. Scholars reconstructed its shape using some depictions of the church. In the Middle Byzantine period, these domed basilicas or basilicas with cupola developed into the cross-shaped churches with cupola. And this kind of this shape of the church turned to be the most popular in the Greek world ever since. You'll see. This is a scheme of such architectural type, form. This is the most known, for probably to us, form, as we know the church, well, as we know at least the Orthodox churches nowadays. It consists of the main part, normally crossed in the shape of the cross, an altar and narthex. The main part of the church is separated from the altar with an iconostasis. That is the most common kind of the Orthodox Church nowadays, especially in the Greek-speaking world. A beautiful example of this church is Church of Hora, or Kariya Jami in Turkey, in Istanbul. It was built in the late 11th, 12th century. That's what remains from it. Actually, it is famous not because of its shape, architectural shape, but because of its mosaics. But again, it's a great example of the architecture of the time. Another example is the Church Kapnikare in Athens. I like this church very much. I used to go there very often. This is a university church, actually. It's located in the center of the city of Athens. It's like a high street of Athens with many, stores and shops. People go there, and this church is like an obstacle to those who go on and through. And when Athens expanded, there were plans to demolish this church just to give space to the road. Fortunately, they managed to preserve it, and it's now a masterpiece of the late Athenian architecture, Byzantine architecture of the 11th century. And this is exactly an example of the cross-shaped church with cupola. Now it comes to the kind of best examples of the Byzantine architecture, which were created, which were built before Byzantium fell, was captured by Turks. We find these examples on Mount Athos. Mount Athos is a still alive community of monks, which is also a museum, a kind of museum, because it features great architecture, great samples of Byzantine art. And I'd like to stay more on the Basilica, the main monasteries of the main churches of the monasteries. You see the shapes of the monasteries there. Different monasteries, different shapes. Probably the most complicated and sophisticated one is the Great Lavra, the oldest monastery on Mount Athos. That is it. That's how it looks now. Well, probably the most developed monastery is Vatopedi. They call it five stars monastery, with very good, well-preserved architecture and huge churches. A rather nice, modest military Byzantine style of Stavronikita. Simonopetra, very impressive. You see how it looks like from the sea level. Another example, a later example of late Byzantine or even post-Byzantine architecture is Meteora, and it has 6 monasteries, and it is located on the impressive rocks, with access sometimes only through baskets, so you can't get there on feet or by car, but only be elevated in a basket. These are the pictures. Well, the sharpness of the picture is not good. It's much better on the screen, believe me. But anyways. Well, a few words about the sacred architecture in the Slavic world. The Slavic world, the Slavs, when they inherited Christianity from Byzantium, they also inherited architecture and patterns of art from them. And you find, for instance, in Balkans, how the Slavs inherited the best pieces of the Byzantine architecture of that time, because the Slavs were converted into Christianity when the cross-shaped style dominated in Byzantium. The Slavs took this kind of architectural style. Well, the cross, actually quite interesting, that the cross-shaped style with cupola, the best, probably the greatest sample of this architecture preserved or was built not in the Byzantium world but in Kiev. The Sophia of Kiev is the most sophisticated, most complex, the greatest example of this late Byzantine style of architecture. Well, this is how it looks. A few old Byzantine features. Nowadays it turned into a Baroque style church. The outside of the church was rebuilt and was shaped into Baroque style, but if you scratch it, you'll find a nice piece of the Byzantine architecture. You see, this is the reconstruction of Sophia of Kiev. Well, we don't find anything more complex and more sophisticated in Byzantium. Well, interesting that Moscow Kremlin, the cathedrals of the Moscow Kremlin, the architecture was also based on the Kievan style, but not only. The people in Moscow started building their cathedrals basing themselves on the Kievan style, but those cathedrals didn't survive, they just fell down. That's why they invited Italian architects to build for them cathedrals, so they managed to do it. And now we see the cathedrals of Moscow like this one, which feature, well, a kind of combination of the Byzantine Kievan style with the Italian patterns of Florence and some Muscovite features. In the 16th century, we find an interesting example of architecture, Russian architecture, which features cone in place of dome. You know, not domes like this, but cones. The reason why this type of architecture appeared is very simple. Such churches were built from wood, and you can't make a wooden dome. You can't, curve a piece of wood. You can only stick pieces of wood together like this, like cone. And later on, even when they started building it with stone, they kept this shape of cone, and these are the so-called pieces of Baroque of Narishkin, the pre-Peter type of architecture. Well, St. Basil, of course, the Cathedral of St. Basil, the kind of icon of Russia. This church was designed to be unusual. It didn't follow any pattern by purpose. The purpose was not to follow any pattern, but to build something completely unusual, completely unseen. The idea was to build a representation of the heavenly kingdom on the earth. And you see this well, will you excuse me if I say it, like Disney fairy tale, you know, something unusual, fairy, embodied in this architecture. It was called a New Jerusalem. It was to represent a New Jerusalem to come, so it was something taken from heaven. Another, well, as we go further in the centuries, we find in the 17th, 18th century the influence, a heavy influence of Baroque style in the Slavic lands and, well, in the Slavic lands. And here you see an example of the Ukrainian Baroque. Actually, this is, imagine what is this? Guess what is this? This is the famous Sophia. That's how it looks now. It turned into a Baroque church, a beautiful Byzantine cross-shaped church with cupola is turned into a Baroque church. You know, you see just a few features here which give you to understand that this was initially a Byzantine church. That's how Baroque came to the Eastern Christian lands and dominated in the 17th, 18th century. In the 18th, 19th century, sacred architecture reflected some secular patterns, in particular the neoclassical patterns. These are the churches, cathedrals of St. Petersburg, built under Peter and his followers. And they are exactly built in the form of the neoclassical style. This cathedral, the Kazan Cathedral, was designed to overcome St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. In the 19th century, also following the examples of neoclassical architecture, a so-called pseudo-Russian eclectic style developed in resemblance of the secular patterns. And this famous Church Christ on the Blood, Savior on the Blood, was built exactly in this pseudo-Russian style. Christ the Savior, the famous cathedral which was rebuilt recently, also was built in this neoclassical style. And a few examples of modern Eastern Christian architecture. This is a new cathedral of St. Savas in Belgrade in Serbia, and this is a new cathedral of Sion in Georgia. You see they feature old things, old architectural styles, and they are brand new. So that's it. That's what I would like to communicate you, to present you today. The history of the development of the Christian architecture. You see, the Christian architecture, the Eastern Christian architecture, reflected influences from the outside. starting from the very beginning with the influences from the pagan architecture. It developed its own great patterns like basilicas, like cross-shaped churches, basilicas with cupola, cross-shaped churches with cupola. Then it also, in the modern time, reflected secular patterns of architecture like neoclassicism, and it was a story, it was a history of communication, actually. It was not an isolated thing, an isolated phenomenon. It breathed, it developed in tune with the developments in the secular architecture. There was always a mutual influence of the secular architecture on the Christian, on the sacred architecture, and vice versa. And again, we see how in the architecture reflected theological outlooks of the people, how theology reflected in the architectural forms, how people's beliefs reflected in them. So it's really a very complex, a very non-linear process, and it continues. That's important. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. In the development from universalist to particularistic characteristics, do you find a corresponding desecration when you create sacred space? What happens to that left outside?
Yes, it's a very good question. It's a very good question because it has to do with the mentality of the people. As you probably know, any religious tradition has what we call now fundamentalism and more open-minded approaches. We find it everywhere, in Islam, in Christianity, in Buddhism, in Hinduism, everywhere. And sometimes people from, say, I can speak now about the Christianity, people who are not so much open-minded with more fundamentalistic approach find themselves comfortable in a closed sacred space. So sometimes they tend to develop particularly designed sacred space to feel safe there, because they think that the space outside is unsafe, is profane, is bad, evil. So sometimes they come out of the dualistic approach. Dualistic approach says that there is something essentially good and something essentially bad. They can't come together. And I choose an essentially good. I find this essentially good in a sacred space, and I close myself in this space. And I close this space make this space isolated from the rest of the world. This is, I believe this is a bad idea, this is a bad approach, but it happens. And it reflects in some patterns of the Christian architecture. We find such features in the medieval art, with a tendency of closing up the Christian community and to make it defended behind the walls of the sacred space. In Byzantium, in the early Christian basilicas, well, it's very personal, I would say. When I visit such basilicas, me personally, I find that this place is open. It's not closed down. It's not a place designated to be, separate from the rest of the world. It's the entire world. Basilica, especially with the cupola is basilica is the entire world. So it's not a closed space, it's a representation of the entire world. And this is a representation of the open-minded person who sees the entire world as good, as created by God, as to be, of course, sanctified by a person, but not to be condemned, not to be expelled. This, I mean, struggle between the two approaches, between the two mentalities, is reflected in the architecture. And we find pieces of architecture which reflect a tendency towards isolation or fundamentalism, if you wish. And we find pieces of architecture which reflect exactly more open-minded approach. That's what I said in the very beginning, that the two approaches, they started from the very beginning of the Christianity. They reflect the Christian message, and they reflect also some traditional pagan, even Old Testament approaches. And in this regard, Christian architecture is not monistic. It's pluralistic in a way of reflecting different tendencies within the Christian community.
Particularly interesting that that the good, in terms of the good space, sacred space, can accommodate pagan space.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
Very
exactly. It's funny. If you go to Athens, there is a church called Small Metropolis. It's a church of St. Eleftherios, built approximately 11th, 12th century. It's a small church, just in the center part of the city. And if you see precisely of what it is built, you find pieces of the old ancient columns, fragments of the depictions of gods, pagan, personages, and so forth. They are all there. They are, they are like, well, I think there is. It's like a hot pot in Chinese cuisine. You put everything there, and you find everything there. It is there. It is not transformed. It is there. They didn't crush it, didn't crush it in order to make them non-recognizable. They are recognizable. The pieces of the pagan, architecture, churches, temples, and they are there. Christians were not afraid of, putting all those things there. They were not afraid of just going to the Parthenon in Acropolis in Athens, and not to crush it, not to demolish it, but just to start using it as a Christian temple. Yeah.
Would you comment on this well-known naming machine using the term Byzantium to describe all of these churches and architecture that arose from Constantinople and from the Emperor Constantinople, and actually substantially different from the original Byzantium city that was in Constantinople
Yeah.
before Constantinople
Yeah.
was built? The term Byzantine seems to cut off the tradition of Constantinople,
Yeah.
the tradition of Rome,
Yeah.
and what these pieces of architecture
Yeah.
are.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is the origin of substituting Byzantine for Constantinople or Roman
Yeah.
or Desk?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a very good question. Well, first, Byzantium never existed. There wasn't Byzantium. It's a new invention, actually, of the modern era. I think there was a publisher, Hieronymus Wolff, a German publisher, who first used this word Byzantium in order to describe Byzantium. Because Byzantines themselves, they called themselves Romans. They were Romans. There were no Byzantines, were Romans. In this regard, it is a bit artificial to separate, to speak about Eastern Christian architecture. It's a bit anachronistic because there was Roman architecture. There was architecture which developed outside of the Roman Empire, like in Persia, after Byzantium lost its territories to Arabs, Christian Arabic architecture, whatever. So it's a bit incorrect to speak about a Byzantine style.
Yes, and of course the Roman Empire, there's famous work in English defined the following Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Substantially about time.
Yeah, yeah,
There was no such thing as a Byzantine Empire.
absolutely so, absolutely, absolutely so. Yeah, yeah,
And even the cathedral in Aachen,
yeah,
Germany, is a reflection of this Romanesque style. It's
yeah,
the revolution of Constantinople.
yeah, yeah,
Very widespread.
yeah.
Very strange that the term Byzantine
Yes.
would be substituted
Yeah.
in this discussion.
Exactly, and in order to better understand Byzantine things, we need to deconstruct Byzantium, the concept of Byzantium, quite surprisingly, but this is the only way to better understand Byzantium, or Byzantium, well, so to say, Byzantium. Yeah.
What do you think the name of the city was before Constantine changed it to his own name?
Yeah.
Byzantium was an ancient Greek city founded about 600 BC by
Yeah.
the city of Miletus.
Yeah.
It,
Yeah.
it was a Greek name,
Yeah.
and actually the first city was founded on the other side,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it turned out to be the wrong side, and so they
Yeah.
then finally built it on the
Yeah.
right side.
Yeah.
But it's for 900 years. The
Yeah.
name of the city was Byzantium.
That's right. Yes, absolutely so.
Byzantium.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was a Greek city.
Yes, absolutely so. Yeah. Yeah.
And
No,
it was
not the most prominent one.
the first 900 years.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was called Byzantium.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And
And it was in the shadow of great cities like Thessaloniki, which was much better known, or cities like, Nicaea, places like, Ephesus especially. Of course, even earlier, it was in the shadow, well, it didn't exist then, of Troy. But again, yes, it was a Greek city, a minor city, not really important. And that's why it was used. I think that we need to speak about the ideology of Constantinople, because there is a strong ideology behind the city. It was a new Rome in a sense that it was qualitatively new. It had to be qualitatively new, something completely different. It's like New York, when refugees from people from Britain went to the New World. They established a New York as something completely different, completely new in comparison with what they left behind. Approximately the same, I may be wrong, but approximately the same is behind the idea of Constantinople, New Rome. When Constantine came to found this place, he wanted to build something completely new, a new Rome, a Christian empire, a center of the Christian empire, which had to change its nature. So that's, so to say, that's why they opted for an insignificant town, even village at that time, as Byzantium was.
So just to redirect the conversation.
Yeah.
The churches in Bethlehem and Jerusalem, Constantine himself built.
Yeah.
They're in this tradition, this idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It seems extremely unusual to actually name them for a Greek city that had nothing to do with the church or the ideology of the creation
Yeah.
of the churches. Those are Roman, Romanesque, Constantine.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Some form, some naming regime would be more accurate expression.
That's right. That's absolutely. You're absolutely correct. That regional names, regional styles connected with regions are more accurate in describing architectural or any kind of art forms than just Byzantium or Eastern or whatever. It is much more correct in terms of Byzantines themselves, because they, in their minds, those pieces of styles of architecture or icon painting or whatever, stamped from particular schools, from particular patterns. Either it was Ephesus or indeed, or Edessa or Jerusalem or Rome or Ravenna or whatever. So it is much more correct, yes, I agree. Yeah. Good.